This is where America began, and almost ended. Virginia witnessed the first permanent English settlement, birthed founding fathers, and became the bloodiest battleground of the Civil War. This is the real history of how one colony built and nearly destroyed a nation. Whispers before the storm, the lost voices of Tsenacomica. Long before Jamestown's sails pierced the eastern horizon, a different Virginia thrived, one of shadowed forests, sacred rivers, and a pulse that beat through the soil itself. Nomadic hunters crept through its wild heart 17,000 years ago, their flint-tipped spears the only mark of their passing. Time wove their descendants into farmers, builders of palisade towns, stewards of the land. By the 1500s, 50,000 native souls moved through this living tapestry, from the corn-rich shores of the Algonquians' Tsenacomica to the forested reaches of the Iroquoian and Siouan peoples. Under Chief Powhatan's quiet command, 30 tribes united, not for war but for survival, guarding ancient trade paths and whispered histories. Yet a storm was gathering beyond the sea. With the arrival of the Europeans came more than musket and quill, came sickness cloaked in breath, silencing 3/4 of Virginia's native voices. What remains is fragmented, seen through foreign eyes, clouded by myth, the truth of Pocahontas and her people blurred like smoke in the morning mist. But listen closely, and the earth still murmurs of what was lost. Jamestown, a land baptized in ashes and gold. In the name of empire and ambition, Virginia was born not with celebration, but with blood and fire. While Spanish Jesuits once scouted the Chesapeake's serene waters, it was under Queen Elizabeth's watchful gaze that Walter Raleigh christened the coast Virginia, a tribute to untouched lands or perhaps her own unwed legacy. Yet it was King James who carved destiny from parchment, sending forth ships in 1606 under Christopher Newport to birth Jamestown in a land both bountiful and unforgiving. What awaited the settlers was not promise but peril. Disease, hunger, and war stalked their every move. John Smith's fragile alliances with Powhatan's people offered a flicker of survival, but once he departed, winter became a sentence. The starving time descended, and corpses outnumbered crops. 8 of every 10 who dared the crossing never lived to tell of it. Still, Virginia's soil held treasure: tobacco, the golden leaf that demanded blood and bone to thrive. Indentured servants came first, then the first enslaved Africans in 1619, shadows whose freedom faded as laws twisted humanity into property. By 1669, slavery was codified, heritable, and lethal. What began as a dream of English glory became a crucible, forging a colony through fire, and leaving deep, lasting scars in its soil. The fire beneath the crown, rebellion and reckoning in colonial Virginia. From the moment Jamestown's smoke curled into the Atlantic sky, Virginia's settlers burned for self-rule. In 1619, amid tobacco dreams and fragile survival, male colonists lit the first spark of democracy with the House of Burgesses. But London's grip tightened, charters revoked, governors crowned by royal decree. Yet the colonists, hardened by hunger and battle, would not kneel easily. In 1635, they dared to arrest their own governor and ship him back to England. William Berkeley's long reign brought cavaliers, class divides, and resentment that festered in the frontier's shadow. Native tribes were trapped in a vice, pressed by Seneca raids, squeezed by settlers' expansion, and ignored by Berkeley's indifference. In 1676, fury ignited. Nathaniel Bacon, voice of the forgotten, led his ragged army of servants and farmers to torch Jamestown. The rebellion shook the colony to its core, birthing Bacon's laws, temporary victories etched in fire. But the aftermath was darker still: treaties that stripped tribes of sovereignty, laws that deepened slavery, and ambitions that now stretched beyond the Appalachians. When France challenged those dreams in 1754, Virginia sent a young major, George Washington, into the crucible of empire. Colonial Virginia had ceased to be a backwater, it was now a battleground of nations, and the birthplace of revolution was stirring. Revolution's heartbeat: how Virginia forged a nation. As the fires of revolution sparked across the colonies, Virginia's voice rose loudest against the chains of British rule. In the hallowed halls of the House of Burgesses, thunderous voices like Patrick Henry cried out against taxation without representation, sowing the seeds of rebellion. When the royal governor dissolved their assembly, Virginian leaders did not falter. They created their own, declaring independence on May 15, 1776, and crafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the philosophical backbone of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. In the crucible of war, Virginia's soil became a battlefield, and its sons, George Washington chief among them, became legends. The clash at Yorktown, where Washington and French allies entrapped Cornwallis, was not just a military triumph, it was the death knell of an empire. With the war won, Virginia again led the way. James Madison shaped the Constitution and gave birth to the Bill of Rights. Its towering influence echoed in Congress, in the presidency, and across the frontier. Carving new states from its vast lands, Virginia earned her title as the Mother of States. But she was also the midwife of liberty, delivering a new nation into the world. The shattered Commonwealth, Virginia's crucible of war. As the nation was torn apart by the horrific realities of slavery, Virginia stood at the epicenter of an ever-deepening divide. Between 1790 and 1860, the number of enslaved people swelled, driving a brutal economy based on human misery, while failed uprisings ignited the flames of rebellion. The tragic truth of broken families and the exploitation of black bodies haunted the plantations, leading to desperate calls for change. When John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 shook the nation, the bloodshed of his execution only galvanized a growing belief that slavery could only be dismantled through force. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 sealed Virginia's fate, leading to its secession and the birth of a confederacy that chose Richmond as its capital. The brutal clash of armies unfolded on Virginian soil, from the bloody Battle of Bull Run to the valiant yet desperate struggles in Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Amidst all this, General Robert E. Lee rose as the Confederate hope, but the weight of endless battles led to his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. In those anguished years, Virginia bore the weight of the nation's deepest wound, a wound that would forever change its people and its place in history. Reconstruction's fragile hope and the rise of segregation. In the wake of the Civil War, Virginia, shattered and scarred, sought to rebuild. Restored to the Union in 1870, the state was thrust into the Reconstruction era, a brief moment where African Americans gained a foothold in society, with land ownership, political rights, and public schools granted in the 1868 Constitution. Yet, the hope for equality was undermined by the Commonwealth's crushing debt and the fierce battle for control between the political factions. The Readjuster Party, led by a coalition of black and white Virginians, found success in revitalizing education and challenging the pre-war debts, but soon crumbled under the weight of racial tensions, culminating in the violent Danville riot of 1883. This tragedy ignited a wave of white supremacy that swept the state, marking the rise of the Democratic Party's stranglehold on Virginia politics and the cruel implementation of Jim Crow laws. By 1902, the state constitution was rewritten to disenfranchise African Americans and poor whites alike, as segregation became the law of the land. Meanwhile, new economic forces brought industrial growth, with Richmond at the center of the tobacco industry and the construction of warships at Newport News. However, even as the Commonwealth entered a new era of economic might, racial violence and oppression, epitomized by the Red Summer of 1919, continued to haunt Virginia's troubled history. The echoes of Reconstruction's fleeting promise were drowned out by the oppressive weight of segregation and inequality. From civil rights struggles to modern-day challenges, Virginia's history of civil rights has been a story of resistance, struggle, and gradual change. In 1951, Barbara Rose Johns, a high school student, led a strike at her segregated school in Prince Edward County, triggering a landmark legal battle that ultimately contributed to the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which dismantled the doctrine of separate but equal. In response, the state segregationist leaders launched the massive resistance strategy, leading to school closures and legal battles. But by 1959, the tide began to turn with the integration of schools in Arlington and Norfolk, and in 1964, Prince Edward County was forced to reopen and integrate its schools after another Supreme Court ruling. The 1960s brought landmark federal legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled institutional racism and segregation in Virginia. In 1967, the Loving v. Virginia case struck down the state's ban on interracial marriage, a crucial victory in the fight for equality. The 1971 Virginia Constitution, rewritten to align with federal mandates, marked a further step toward civil rights, while the election of Douglas Wilder as the first African-American governor in the U.S. in 1989 symbolized a new era in Virginia politics. Meanwhile, Northern Virginia's economy and population surged with the expansion of federal offices during the Cold War, contributing to regional growth. Yet, the state continued to grapple with racial injustice, as exemplified by the violent clashes at the 2017 Charlottesville rally, when a white supremacist drove his car into protesters, killing one, and the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, which led to the removal of Confederate monuments. These events have highlighted the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice, showing that while Virginia has made significant strides, its history of racial and social divisions continues to shape its present. Today, Virginia's past is written in its colonial buildings, Civil War battlefields, and presidential homes. But how much of this history do we really understand? What Virginia story deserves more attention? Debate in the comments.